something happens, maybe a long time ago, maybe more recently. And on the surface, you've got on with your life, you've managed. But there are moments, a smell, a sound, a particular type of silence, when something shifts inside you and your body responds as though it's all happening all over again. You might not even have words for it. You just know that some part of you is still there, still in that moment, in a way that the rest of you has never quite been able to explain. And if that sounds familiar, you might have already heard about EMDR, or perhaps someone has suggested it to you, and you're not sure what to make of it. Maybe it sounds strange, or you're not sure whether it's quite the right thing for you. And that's exactly what today's conversation is here to address, because EMDR is one of the most effective and well-researched trauma therapies available. And this is also one of the least understood. So I'm Ian Stockbridge, founder of Hope Therapy and Counselling Services. And today I'm joined by someone who doesn't just understand EMDR in theory, but actually practices it herself. With me today is Wendy Castellino, an independent CBT psychotherapist and EMDR therapist, and the co-presenter of the Talkroom, who's been working in the field of mental health and well-being for well over 35 years. Wendy brings, as always, a depth of clinical experience to this conversation that I think you're really going to appreciate, particularly on EMDR, which she practices herself. So Wendy, a very, very warm welcome to you as always.
Thank you, Ian. And for anyone who hasn't come across the Talkroom before, Ian Stockbridge is the founder of Hope Therapy and Counselling Services and a senior accredited member of the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society. He leads a large, experienced team of therapists working across a range of presentations, and he brings a genuine clinical intelligence to everything this podcast does. It's also good to be here, so thank you. So today we're talking about EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This is one of the most thoroughly researched trauma therapies in existence, but also one of the most misunderstood. So today we're going to cover what it actually is, what happens in a session, who's it's for, and what it feels like when it's working. Ian, you lead a team that includes EMDR specialists, and you've sat with a great many clients who've been through this process. So let's start with the basics, because I think EMDR is one of those terms that people hear and immediately feel a little bit intimidated by it. Even the name, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, sounds quite clinical. So what would you say to someone who genuinely has no idea what this is?
And that's a really, really great place to start, Wendy, because you're right, the name does do EMDR a disservice. It sounds really, really technical. And the reality is actually is quite a human process. The short version is this: EMDR is a structured therapy that helps the brain to process experiences that it's never fully been able to digest, particularly traumatic experiences or distressing ones that have become stuck in some form. So when something overwhelming happens to us, the brain's normal processing system can get disrupted. And instead of filing the experience away in the past, the way most memories tend to work is that it can stay raw and vivid and present. So when something in the current environment triggers it, even something that can be quite small on the face of it, the person doesn't just remember it, they feel it physically, emotionally, as though it's happening all over again. And EMDR works specifically with those stuck memories and just helps the brain complete the processing it wasn't able to do at the time.
Okay, that's really interesting, Ian. So it's not about forgetting what happened. It's about the memory losing its power to trigger these responses.
Well, exactly. And I think that's a really, really important distinction. Clients sometimes come to EMDR thinking that they need to forget or that the therapy will somehow erase what happens. And it doesn't do that, nor should it. Our experiences are a part of us, of who we are. What changes is how the memory is held. So after successfully EMDR processing, people often describe the memory just as feeling more distant, as feeling less charged, as though it belongs to the past rather than still happening now in the present. And that shift can be genuinely, genuinely profound for some people.
That's really interesting. It's a very interesting difference there. Um, and I believe you mentioned that EMDR uses eye movements, which I think is the part that confuses people the most. Can you actually explain what that involves?
Well, the eye movements, or more accurately, the bilateral stimulation, because it can also involve things like taps or sounds, are the distinctive feature of EMDR. They're also the thing that makes people say, hang on a second, that sounds really odd. So, what the bilateral stimulation is doing is engaging both hemispheres of the brain alternatively, while the person brings the distressing memory into focus. And the mechanism is still being researched, but the leading theory draws a really interesting comparison with REM sleep, that period of dreaming sleep where the eyes move very, very rapidly and where the brain does a really significant amount of emotional and memory processing. It seems that the bilateral element of EMDR activates a very similar process window, which allows the memory to be reprocessed in a way that reduces its emotional intensity. And I want to be really clear. This is delivered by a trained EMDR therapist in a carefully structured session. It's not something you replicate at home with a YouTube video. The bilateral stimulation on its own does nothing. It's the therapeutic relationship, the structure, the preparation, and the skilled guidance of the therapist that makes it all come together and makes it work.
Very interesting. I think that's really, really interesting. Thank you so much for explaining that, Ian. And I think what actually happens question is one of the most searched things about EMDR. People want to know what they're walking into. Having practiced EMDR myself, I can speak about this, but I love to hear how you would describe it to clients who are considering it, Ian.
So, and I should say, Wendy, as a practicing EMDR therapist, you will want to add this or correct me if I'm simplifying things here. But what I might tell a client who considering EMDR is that it's a structured process with very distinct phases. And the session where the eye movements actually happen is not the first session, or not necessarily. There's preparation that comes before it, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize. So that early phase is about building what's called resourcing. And the therapist just helps clients to identify internal resources, ways of grounding themselves so that they've something to return to if processing becomes distressing at any point. And that's especially important when we're working with trauma because we're working with material that is, by its very nature, incredibly difficult for people. And the therapist needs to know that the client has that stable foundation before opening up the processing work that's going to take place.
Of course, that's exactly right, Ian. And I'd add that in my practice, the assessment, formulation, and the preparation phase is often where the therapeutic relationship is. It's really important that it is established in that process. It's really important that the client needs to trust that I know what I'm doing and that I will not push them somewhere where they aren't ready to go. And also that we will always ensure that there is a process where they are in a stable place at the end of the session and they know how to resource themselves after the session as well. So it's never good practice to end an EMDR session with something unresolved or if the client is in a dysregulated state.
Yeah.
That's another principle of EMDR.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really, really important point. And it's something I think can just alleviate a lot of the anxiety for clients who are nervous about starting this type of therapy. EMDR is not a process of just opening up a wound and leaving it open. The session has a very clear beginning, a clear middle, and an end. And the therapist brings the client to a stable, to a grounded state before they leave.
Absolutely, and that's really important that the person does feel contained as part of the session as well. And sometimes it's not always possible. Sometimes a person still might be upset, but they know how to ground themselves continually after a session as well. So that principle carries on after the session as well as the end of the session.
Oui.
And when the eye movement or bilateral stimulation part actually happens, could you explain a little bit more what that looks like from the outside?
Absolutely. So the image that most people have of someone following a moving finger or a light is broadly accurate for the eye movement version, though some therapists, as I said earlier, will use tapping on the knee or the shoulder, or they use headphones with alternating sounds. What the client is doing whilst that's happening is holding the target memory in mind, not narrating it in detail, not analyzing it, just noticing what comes up as the bilateral stimulation runs. And then there's a pause. The therapist asks, and the process continues. The client is guiding it as much as the therapist. They're absolutely not a passive participant within this. And what the therapist is watching for is the processing moving, associations appearing, the memory starting to shift, the emotional intensity beginning to reduce a little. And sometimes people find that memories linked to other memories, or that a new insight about a past experience might start to surface. And the therapist follows that movement rather than directing it. It's a genuinely collaborative process. And that surprises a lot of people. The client is guiding it as much as the therapist.
Yeah, I think what you said is, there's a danger that people feel it's been done to them. It's actually a partnership. I've used the word partnership, which is good. I think another point really is that I often tell clients before we start there's no way to do it wrong. Their role is simply to, engage in the process and to notice and to communicate what's going on back as well. And it's actually the person's brain. It's the healing possibility of the brain that does the actual process itself.
Mm.
So Ian, let's then start to talk about who EMDR is for. So when we talk about EMDR and the trauma in the same breath, I think people immediately assume that this is only for people who've been through something catastrophic. Say, for example, a trauma of a major accident, or the trauma of war, or trauma of severe abuse. And that can make people dismiss it as not being relevant to their particular experience. So how do you think about who MDR is for?
Mm. And this is something I feel really strongly about, because that assumption keeps a lot of people from getting help that they genuinely need. EMDR was originally developed for PTSD, for people who had experienced what we call big T trauma, the kind of events um, that immediately register as extreme. So combat, serious accidents, assault. And the evidence base for those presentations is really very exceptional. EMDR has the strongest research support for any trauma therapy, and it's recommended by organizations like the World Health Organization for NICE, precisely because the evidence base is so robust. But the understanding of trauma has also evolved, and so has the application of EMDR. We now understand that the nervous system doesn't process distress on a scale of objective severity. What matters is not how significant the event looks from the outside. What matters is how the person's system responded to it. And many people carry the legacy of experiences that didn't look particularly dramatic, but were deeply, deeply overwhelming at the time, particularly in childhood when the developing brain is much more vulnerable.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. The things such as a difficult childhood relationship, or maybe repeated experiences of a child not being believed or themselves being dismissed, or the kind of chronic stress that sometimes can accumulate over years, rather than arriving in a single moment. They're all possible to use within EMDR. I think that's what you're saying.
Exactly that. So, what some people call the small t of trauma, which I slightly resist as a term because it can imply something less worthy of care. Um, but it involves those accumulated experiences that shape someone's sense of safety, their sense of self, their patterns in relationships. And EMDR can be really well suited to working with that type of material too. It's also used effectively for things like for grief, for loss, for phobias, for anxiety that has a very clear point of origin, and sometimes for the kind of complex relational difficulties that can trace back to earlier experiences. I think the common thread is there's material that the mind hasn't fully processed. Is there a stuck point, a place where something happened that the person's nervous system hasn't been able to file away in the past? And if the answer is yes, then EMDR is worth considering. And the way to find out whether it's right for a particular person is to have that conversation with somebody that understands it, a qualified therapist, which is exactly what our free consultation is designed for. And I know you have those types of conversations as well, Wendy.
Absolutely. And that's a really important point, Ian. Obviously, therapy isn't about self-diagnosing or categorizing your own experience. What can be really helpful is just before you start therapy, just have a conversation with someone who can perhaps help you work out what you need. What you
Absolutely.
might reference. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we'll come back in a moment to talk about what EMDR actually feels like from the client's perspective and what to expect if you decide to pursue it. But if anything we've talked about so far has felt familiar, if you have a sense of something that just feels stuck, or experiences that still have more weight in your present situation than you'd like them to have, I just want to mention that the team at Hope do offer a free 15-minute consultation. I know you do exactly the same thing. So there's that opportunity for a conversation. It's very much non-pressurized, there's no commitment. And our role, yours and ours, Wendy, is simply to listen and to help people to find out whether therapy might be right for them, and if so, what kind. You can find the links to our bios in the show notes. So we'll carry on then.
Hmm. Okay. So in next, I think I want to address what you think is the single biggest barrier to people considering EMDR. I mean, which is the fear that means having to go through everything all over again. The problem that is that it means opening up for the worst thing that ever happened to you and reliving every detail. Is that really what EMDR involves?
And a really, really important question. And the simple answer to that is no, absolutely not. And I want to be really clear about this, because I think this misconception stops people who could genuinely benefit from even having the conversation. EMDR is fundamentally different from traditional talking therapies in that respect. In some approaches, you might be asked to narrate an experience in detail, to describe what happened, to go through it verbally. EMDR doesn't work like that. You don't need to tell the therapist exactly what happened, every detail. You don't need to put it into words in that form. What you're doing is holding the memory in mind at a distance, rather than completely immersing yourself within it, while that bilateral stimulation runs. And the therapist will ask what you're noticing, but they're not asking for a really detailed narrative account of what happened. And many clients are really relieved by that, particularly those who have experiences that they find really difficult or maybe even impossible to articulate. So either because there just are no words to be able to explain the horror of what happened, or because the act of speaking about it simply feels far too exposing.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And from my own personal clinical experience, which does, really quite often surprise clients, is that the processing can happen there doesn't need to be a verbal description at all. It's amazing that the brain seems to do the work, regardless of whether the event has put into words. There's nothing wrong with retelling the story or expressing your feelings and that. And that's sometimes part of the process. Sometimes people feel the need to speak, but actually having the choice not to speak is also very freeing for the clients.
Mm. Mm. Which is part of what makes EMDR so compelling for experiences that happened very early, maybe before language was fully developed for some people, or for experiences that were so overwhelming that they would never encode it in a way that can be easily narrated. The processing happens at a very different level.
Absolutely. And I think there's another concern with EMDR, that EMDR will make things worse before they get better.
Yeah,
That might be hard for some people.
I think that's a really, really important and a really legitimate question, and really worth taking seriously. So processing difficult material does mean that some of it becomes more present during the course of therapy. There can be a period of increased emotional sensitivity, maybe vivid dreams for some people, or things surfacing between sessions. That's not a sign that something is going wrong. It's often a sign that processing is actually underway. But it's exactly why the preparation phase matters so much, why the therapeutic relationship matters so much, and why EMDR should only be undertaken with a properly trained therapist who can support the client through that process properly. And what I would say is that at Hope, and again, I know this is true of you as well, Wendy, our EMDR therapists are trained to assess readiness very carefully. They won't they won't begin the processing phases until they're confident the client has the internal resources to manage what might come up. And that conversation about readiness is very much part of the work that happens. It's not a preliminary before the real thing starts.
Mm, absolutely. And one thing that I sometimes do is choose a small current issue that they want to work on, which hasn't got anything to do with the actual traumatic experience. So they get a little bit taste of what EMDR does, like how it feels to process it. And that often works very well with clients. So there are ways of doing it so they don't feel overwhelmed. That's not the idea of EMDR.
Mm.
So you've talked about EMDR and how it works. But I'd quite like to bring in the felt experience a little. What can you give us some examples of what clients actually describe when it's working?
Yeah, the thing that comes up most consistently, and I've heard this from clients who have worked with REMDR therapists, from colleagues in the profession, and it aligns with very much with the research that's out there. It's just a sense of distance from the memory that wasn't there before. Something that felt immediate and present just begins to feel like it belongs in the past. People say things like, I can think about it now without my whole body responding. Or they might say, it feels like a fact rather than something that's still happening to me today. And I think that shift, often described as a kind of relief, that's how I'd best describe it, I think, Wendy.
Mm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, an example I can give is that I've heard clients describe it as a memory becoming quieter, like the volume has been turned down. I think that's great, isn't it?
Yeah, a really, really beautiful way of putting it. And as we've already said, the memory doesn't disappear, it's still there. And the person knows what happened, but the alarm system that was attached to it, the physical response, the flooding of emotions, the sense of immediate threat, that just quietens down a little. And for people who have been living with that level of activation for years, sometimes for decades, the change can feel almost quite surreal to start with.
Yes, what I often joke about with clients is people often call EMDR therapy as weird therapy. It feels weird. They don't use that word. They always use the word weird, not other strange. I mean, would you use the word weird? It should be called the weird therapy. And that's how people, because it's so powerful. They don't always. It's difficult to understand it when they shift it. But what about the process itself? What do clients describe? What happens during the actual bilateral stimulation in? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
A really, really good question. And it varies a lot. And I think that's worth saying so that people don't arrive with a set expectation, with a fixed idea of what they should be experiencing. Some people find associations arise, maybe a related memory, an image, a physical sensation that just connects them somehow to the original experience. Some people find themselves moving very, very quickly, the intensity reducing in a way that can be really surprising to them, actually. Other people might find it more slow, more effortful. And all of those things are perfectly normal and natural. We're not doing it wrong. Again, remembering that the therapist is trained to work with whatever arises. So what clients often notice in the session itself is just a gradual reduction in the subjective units of distress, the SUD level, the subjective unit of distress, as it's called in EMDR practice. When they bring the target memory to mind, where a memory might have registered as a 9 or a 10 out of 10 previously, or maybe even at the beginning of the session, the goal is for that just to reduce through processing. So that reduction doesn't always happen in a single session, particularly for really complex trauma, but the movement tends to be detectable. And that measurable quality is one of the things I find so genuinely impressive about the whole EMDR model. The therapist and client can both track the progress that's being made by the client, which is a really, really lovely thing that both of you can see that.
Absolutely, yes. And again, it's an important part of the process to sort of track what's going on and to share that with the client. So the numbering system works quite well when you measure the SUDS. It's a good way of doing it. I just want to change focus a little bit, Ian. And for someone perhaps who's listening who is starting to think that this might be relevant to them, what would you say to them about how to take the next step?
Really good question, and a really, really important question. And the first thing I'd say is you don't need to arrive knowing which therapy you need. That's not a decision you necessarily should have to make alone. And frankly, it's not a decision you can make well without talking to someone who knows a little bit about the landscape. So I think what I would always encourage is if someone, if something that we've talked about today has landed, if there's a part of your experience that has felt maybe more present than it should, more intrusive than you'd like, more connected to the past than to where you actually are now, then that experience is worth bringing into a conversation. And at Hope, the team around me include qualified, experienced EMDR therapists who've worked with a wide range of presentations, as you yourself have done regularly, Wendy. Not everyone who comes to us for trauma support will need EMDR specifically. Other people may choose something different. There are other really effective trauma-informed approaches. For many people, it is the right tool. The way to find out is simply to talk about it. And that's what the free consultations that we and you will offer. It's not a sales conversation. It's genuinely an opportunity to be heard, to describe what you're carrying, and just to get a really honest sense of whether and how we may be able to help.
Mm, absolutely. And I think I would add from my own experience as a EMDR practitioner that so many of the people who find their way to EMDR have often been carrying something for a very long time, sometimes years. And I think there's something really quite significant about finally sitting in a room where someone says, yes, what you are describing is real and there is a way of working with it. That alone can be incredibly powerful, even before the therapy has begun, just knowing that it's possible to work on this.
Yeah, again, really, really beautifully put, Wendy. And I think it speaks to something that underpins everything, actually. Everything that we do, the starting point is always just simply being heard, not assessed, not categorized, not giving a form to fill in, simply being heard. And everything else flows from that. So before we close, let me pull together a few of the key things I hope listeners and viewers have taken away from what we've talked about today. So EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing is a structured, evidence-based therapy that helps the brain just to process experiences that have become stuck. It's particularly effective for trauma, PTSD, though its application is far broader than just that. It doesn't require you to narrate what happened in huge detail. It doesn't mean reliving the past. It involves working with a trained therapist who will prepare you carefully and support you throughout the process. And for many people, it produces a shift in how they hold difficult memories, a quietening, a distance, a sense that the past is finally somewhere other than the present. And if people would like to find out whether EMDR or any form of trauma informed support might be right for them, I genuinely encourage them just to reach out and take the first step. So at Hope Therapy, we offer, as we've mentioned, a free 15-minute consultation. It's simply a conversation. There's no commitment, there's no pressure. It absolutely is not a sales call. And our role is to listen and to help people to work out what kind of support makes sense for where they are right now. They can book directly through the link in the show notes. And as ever, they can find out everything about us by going to the web www.hopefulminds.co.uk. That's www.hopefulminds.co.uk.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ian. That's really important to say. And I work independently as a CBT psychotherapist and EMDR therapist. And you can find out more about working with me directly at my website, wendycastellino.com. That link is in the show notes. So it's been a real pleasure exploring this today, Ian. EMDR is a therapy that I feel genuinely passionate about, and I hope this conversation helps someone take that first step.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you to everyone listening. If this is an episode that's been helpful in any way, please do subscribe, whether you listen to the podcasts. It genuinely helps other people find us. And we will see you in the next one.
Take good care, everyone, and thank you for listening.